All right, wow. You really went all in on this one, asking us to break down racketeering conspiracy.
Yeah, we had to dig through a mountain of material for this deep dive. Court cases, legal
The
journals.
whole shebang. But hey, that's what we do here, right? Unravel these complex topics, cut through all the jargon, kind of like giving you a crash course in organized crime.
Without having to go undercover,
Yeah,
hopefully.
exactly. And this time, it all comes down to groups, how they work together, the patterns of illegal activity, and how this thing called the IOWAO Act, that's the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act.
A mouthful, I know.
Yeah, but it packs a punch. It's used to take down entire criminal enterprises. And get this, we're not just talking about the usual suspects.
Oh no, this goes way beyond the mob.
Think big corporations. Like, we're going to be digging into a case involving one of the biggest energy companies in the U.S.
Now that's a story for the books. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's lay down some groundwork.
Back to basics.
Exactly. What actually makes something a racketeering conspiracy? What are the ingredients, so to speak?
Okay, I gotta admit, when I hear racketeering, my mind goes straight to, the movies. Smoke-filled rooms, shady deals, all that. But I suspect it's a bit more complicated than that.
You're right, it's not just about appearances. Legally speaking, there are three key elements we're looking at. An enterprise.
Okay, an enterprise.
Then there's conspiracy.
Conspiracy sounds ominous.
And finally, the pattern of racketeering activity.
Pattern of racketeering activity. All right, a lot to unpack there.
We'll tackle them one by one, don't worry. So, starting with enterprise, what comes to mind when you hear that word? In this context, I mean.
I guess a group of criminals working together, is that too simplistic?
It's a good starting point, but RICO casts a wider net than you might think. We're not just talking about your typical mafia families or street gangs.
There's more to it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any group involved in illegal activities could be classified as an enterprise under RICO. That includes corrupt businesses or even businesses that look totally legit but are actually fronts for something criminal.
Whoa, hold on. So even a business that looks totally normal could be a criminal enterprise.
Precisely. If they're using their business structure, their resources to commit crimes, they fit the definition. It's not just about the who, but the how and the why.
So it's not just some guys hanging out in a dark alley. It could be happening right under our noses in a fancy office building.
Exactly. Organized crime can be very sophisticated.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Definitely. And that brings us to our next element, conspiracy.
Conspiracy. Always sounds so secretive. Does it literally mean people plotting in the shadows to break the law?
Well, there's definitely an element of agreement involved. For RICO, conspiracy means two or more people have decided, they've agreed to commit those racketeering activities.
Okay, so they've made a pact.
But here's the catch. It's the agreement itself that makes it illegal. They don't even have to fully go through with the act.
Wait, so even if they just planned something but never actually did it, they can still get charged?
That's the power of RICO. It allows law enforcement to step in before things get out of hand, maybe even stop those crimes from happening in the first place.
I see. So it's not just about catching them red-handed. It's about preventing future harm.
Precisely. Prevention is key. Now, this doesn't apply to just any two crimes. There needs to be a connection between them. That's where the pattern of racketeering activity comes into play.
Right, the pattern. Like a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to the bigger scheme.
You got it. To be considered a pattern under RICO, there have to be at least two offenses, and they have to be connected. Not just random, unrelated crimes, but actions that are all part of furthering that enterprise's goals.
Okay, so it's like a puzzle.
Yeah,
All the pieces have to fit together to show a bigger picture of criminal activity.
a perfect analogy. But what kind of crimes are we talking about? What actually qualifies as racketeering?
Yeah, give us some examples.
Well, we're talking about a pretty wide range. Bribery, extortion, money laundering, drug trafficking, even murder is on the list.
Wow, so it's not just about stealing a TV here and there. This is serious stuff.
Oh, absolutely. There are 35 specific offenses listed under RUO. It covers a lot of ground.
35. All right, let me make sure I'm following. So we've got our enterprise, the group with a shared criminal goal.
Yeah.
We've got the conspiracy, the agreement to commit crimes, and then the pattern, at least two related offenses within the 10-year period. That's when RICO comes into play, right?
Bingo, you've got it. And what sets RICO apart from other laws is that it doesn't just go after individuals.
It goes after the whole operation.
Exactly, the entire organization. That's why the penalties are so heavy.
Okay, so how heavy are we talking? Lay it on me.
We're talking up to 20 years in prison per IOO charge, plus massive fines. And that's not even the worst of it. They can also seize your assets.
Asset forfeiture, right? Like they can take your house, your cars, everything.
Anything that can be traced back to those illegal activities, gone. The government wants to dismantle these criminal organizations from top to bottom.
I can see how that would make people think twice.
It was designed to be a powerful deterrent. And, it was originally conceived as a way to take down the mafia, to disrupt traditional organized crime.
Makes sense. Go after the big fish.
But as we'll see, its application has expanded far beyond that.
That's what I'm really curious about. You mentioned earlier that RICO isn't just for the stereotypical mobster anymore. So give us an example, something outside of that Godfather world.
Well, one of the most famous cases involves Enron, a massive energy company that collapsed in the early 2000s. Their executives were charged with racketeering conspiracy under RICO.
Wait, Enron, the company that was all over the news for financial fraud. What does that have to do with organized crime?
That's a great question. And it highlights how RICO can be used in ways that go beyond the traditional image of, mob bosses and backroom deals. Enron's downfall was this complex web of accounting fraud, shady business dealings.
They were cooking the books, basically.
Essentially, yes. They were misleading investors, enriching themselves while the company and its employees suffered the consequences.
So even though they weren't running a traditional mob operation, their actions still qualified as a racketeering enterprise.
Precisely. And that's what makes RICO so powerful. It can target criminal activity even if it's happening within a seemingly legitimate corporation.
So white-collar criminals, they're not off the hook.
Not at all. The Enron case really shook things up, sent a message to the corporate world that RICO wasn't just for mobsters anymore. Several executives were convicted, ended up serving serious time.
So it's not just about busting down doors and making arrests. It's about holding powerful people accountable for these complex schemes.
Exactly. RICO has a much broader reach than some people might realize. And we have another example, a case known as Operation Iron Triangle, which really illustrates how RICO can be used to target different levels of involvement.
Iron Triangle, that sounds a bit more like what we typically picture when we think of organized crime.
It does, but this case involved a multi-state operation. Illegal gambling, drug trafficking, loan sharking.
The whole 9 yards.
But what's interesting is that RICO allowed law enforcement to go after not just the guys on the street, but also the people running the show behind the scenes.
The masterminds.
Exactly. So even if you're not the one directly committing the crime, if you're the one calling the shots, organizing everything, you're still liable under RICO.
So it's about dismantling the entire structure, not just catching a few bad apples.
Precisely. It's about addressing the root of the problem. Now, this all sounds pretty serious. It makes you wonder if there's any way to fight back against a RICO charge.
Yeah, are there any defenses?
Yeah.
Or is it pretty much game over once they come after you?
Well, there are defenses, but they can be incredibly hard to prove. One option is to argue that you weren't really part of the agreement, that you didn't know what was going on.
Pleading ignorance, basically.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
You could also try to challenge the idea that there even was a pattern of criminal activity. Maybe the offenses weren't actually related, or they weren't connected to the overall goals of the enterprise.
It's like trying to pick apart the prosecution's case, piece by piece.
Exactly. And of course, there's always the insufficient evidence argument. But with RICO cases, the prosecution usually comes prepared with a mountain of evidence.
So you're going to need a pretty good lawyer.
That's for sure. There are a few other defense strategies, but they're even more challenging to pull off. Things like entrapment, where you argue that you were tricked by law enforcement into committing a crime you wouldn't have done otherwise, or withdrawal from the conspiracy, meaning you actively removed yourself from the criminal enterprise before any illegal acts took place.
So it's not like Hail Marys.
They're definitely long shots. So yeah, facing a RICO charge is not a situation you want to be in. But let's zoom out for a second. This goes beyond individual cases, right? There are bigger implications here.
That's what I was thinking. This is all very fascinating, but how does it relate to the average person? What's the bigger picture?
That's an important question. And it's one we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive. Because while RICO has been a successful tool against organized crime, it's not without its critics and its controversies.
All right, so we've established that RICO is a pretty heavy hitter when it comes to fighting organized crime. But you mentioned there's some controversy surrounding it. What are people saying?
Well, one of the main criticisms is that the definition of an enterprise is so broad that RICO could be used against groups that aren't really what it was intended for.
So you're saying it could be used against groups that aren't really, organized crime in the traditional sense.
Exactly. The concern is that it could be used to target groups or individuals whose actions, while maybe technically illegal, don't pose the same kind of threat as a massive fraud scheme or a powerful mafia family.
I see. So it's a question of scale, like how big of a threat does a group have to be to justify using RICO?
Right. And there have been cases where RICO was used to prosecute groups involved in, say, environmental protests or political activism.
Really, so not traditional criminal activity.
Exactly. And those cases raise concerns about whether RICO was being applied too broadly, potentially infringing on things like free speech and the right to assemble.
That's a tricky line to walk for sure. Balancing the need to combat crime with protecting individual rights.
It is, and there's a lot of debate about whether the law needs to be more specific, more narrowly tailored to ensure that it's not being misused.
It seems like finding that balance is always a challenge in the legal system.
It is, but the fact that this debate is happening is a good thing, right? It means we're constantly evaluating the law, making sure it's serving its purpose without overstepping its boundaries.
Makes sense. Okay, let's go back to something we touched on earlier, asset forfeiture. Taking away the profits from criminal activity, that seems like a pretty powerful deterrent.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's one of the most effective tools in RICO's arsenal. By taking away those ill-gotten gains, you hit these criminal organizations where it hurts.
Right in the wallet.
Exactly. And it's not just about fines. We're talking about seizing houses, cars, bank accounts, anything that can be traced back to those illegal activities.
Wow, so they really clean house.
They can, and it's not just tangible assets either. The government can also seize intangible assets like intellectual property rights or stock holdings.
That's pretty far-reaching. But what about assets that were acquired legally? Let's say someone involved in a racketeering scheme also owns a legitimate business. Can the government seize assets from that business, even if it wasn't directly involved?
That's a great question, and it gets into some of the more controversial aspects of asset forfeiture, because the answer isn't always clear-cut. There have been cases where assets from legitimate businesses were seized simply because of their connection to someone involved in racketeering.
That seems a little unfair, punishing a business that wasn't actually doing anything wrong.
Right, and critics argue that this can make legitimate business owners hesitant to work with anyone who might even be remotely connected to criminal activity.
I can see that. Who wants to risk losing their entire business because of someone else's actions?
It's a valid concern, and it highlights the need for clear guidelines and safeguards when it comes to asset forfeiture to make sure it's not being used unjustly.
So it's about finding that balance again, making sure the punishment fits the crime and that innocent parties aren't being harmed.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, and one that deserves careful consideration.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I feel like we've gone down so many different paths, exploring all the ins and outs of racketeering conspiracy and the RICO Act.
We've covered a lot of ground, that's for sure.
And it's amazing how what might seem like a straightforward criminal case can actually lead to all these complex legal questions, ethical dilemmas, and even societal implications.
It really shows how interconnected everything is. Law, ethics, society, it's all woven together.
It is. It's also a bit humbling to realize how much we still don't know.
That's part of what makes this so fascinating, though, right? The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to explore.
True. But let's bring it back to our listener for a moment. Why should they care about all of this?
Yeah.
How does racketeering conspiracy and the RICO Act relate to their everyday lives?
That's a great question, and I think it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract legal concepts. They have real-world implications for all of us. Organized crime isn't just something you see in movies. It's a real threat that can take many forms, from those traditional mafia families to these sophisticated white-collar schemes we talked about.
So it's not just some far-off legal drama, it's something that could potentially affect anyone.
Exactly. And while RICO is a powerful tool for fighting organized crime, it's not without its flaws. We've talked about the potential for overreach, the need to protect individual rights. So it's important to stay informed, to be engaged in the conversation about how these laws are used, and to make sure they're being applied fairly and justly.
So we can't just assume the system will always get it right. We need to be active participants, holding those in power accountable.
Absolutely. And that brings me to another key takeaway from our deep dive: the importance of critical thinking. When we hear about these complex cases involving RICO, or any legal issue for that matter, it's easy to get caught up in the headlines and jump to conclusions.
Yeah, it's easy to get swept up in the drama of it all.
But it's crucial to take a step back, examine the facts, and consider different perspectives before forming an opinion.
Be a discerning consumer of information, basically.
Exactly, especially when it comes to legal issues that can have such significant consequences.
And it's like you always say, question everything.
Well, maybe not everything, but asking questions, challenging assumptions, being willing to dig a little deeper, those are all essential for understanding the world around us.
Couldn't agree more. All right, well, this deep dive has been incredibly informative. I think it's safe to say our listener now has a much deeper understanding of racketeering conspiracy and the RICO Act.
And hopefully a newfound appreciation for the complexities of the legal system.
Definitely. But as always, we want to leave our listener with something to ponder, something to spark further exploration.
I think a good question to consider is this. Given how broadly RICO can be applied, is it ultimately a necessary tool for fighting organized crime? Or does it risk being used too broadly, potentially ensnaring individuals or organizations that may not be engaged in the kind of widespread criminal activity it was initially designed to address?
That's a great question. It really gets to the heart of the debate surrounding the RICO Act.
It does. And it's a question that deserves careful consideration, thoughtful discussion, and ongoing scrutiny.
It's like we've given our listener a key to a whole new library filled with legal thrillers and true crime stories.
And now it's up to them to choose which path to explore next. They could dive into specific cases where RICO has been used, look into the arguments for and against its broad application. There's a whole rabbit hole to go down here.
I'm already feeling another deep dive coming on.
Uh-huh.
But for now, I think we've given our listener plenty to think about.
I'd say so. We've explored the history of RICO, how it's been used to target both traditional organized crime and white-collar criminals. We've even talked about its potential use against political activists. We've delved into the complexities of asset forfeiture and debated the risks of overreach. It's been a pretty comprehensive journey.
A whirlwind tour of the legal landscape for sure. And I think along the way, we've also touched on some bigger themes, ideas that go beyond the specifics of RICO.
Absolutely. We've talked about critical thinking, the balance between security and freedom, and how the law is constantly evolving to reflect our values as a society.
Big ideas. And it's a good reminder that learning is a never-ending process.
Couldn't agree more. There's always something new to discover.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dives.
Until next time, keep those minds engaged.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. It really is like we've handed them a map.
A treasure map, almost, leading to all these fascinating cases, legal arguments.
And they get to choose their own adventure, which case to crack open, which debate to dive into. There's just so much out there.
Endless possibilities, really. And, even after all our research, I still feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Me too. It's amazing how much depth there is to this one topic, RICO, racketeering.
It just goes to show there's always more to learn.
Always. But I think for now, we've given our listener a pretty solid foundation.
Yeah, definitely enough to get them started on their own deep dive.
Exactly. So to recap, where do we even begin with this one? It's like a whirlwind tour of the legal world.
We started with the basics, the definition of racketeering, the three main elements, the enterprise, the conspiracy, the pattern of activity.
Right, the RICO recipe.
Exactly. Then we looked at how it's been used to target traditional organized crime, the mafia families.
But we also saw how it's been applied to white-collar crime, even political activism. It's a versatile tool, that's for sure.
Very much so. And of course, we had to talk about asset forfeiture, one of the most powerful and controversial aspects of RICO.
Yeah, the government taking away those ill-gotten gains. Makes you think twice before getting involved in any shady business.
Definitely a deterrent. But as we discussed, there are concerns about it being used unfairly, the potential for overreach.
Right, always that balancing act between keeping people safe and protecting their rights.
It's a delicate balance and one that's constantly being debated and refined, which is a good thing, right? It means we're having those important conversations about the role of the law in our society.
Exactly. It's not just about blindly following rules. It's about understanding the why, the how, and the potential impact.
Critical thinking, questioning assumptions, those are skills that are valuable in any context, not just when we're talking about law.
So true. This has been quite the journey, hasn't it? From those smoke-filled back rooms to the boardrooms of corporate giants, we've covered a lot of ground.
And I think we've equipped our listener with the knowledge they need to continue exploring this fascinating world of RICO and organized crime.
Their own deep dive awaits. Any parting words of wisdom before we wrap up?
Just keep those minds curious. Keep learning. Keep asking questions. There's always something new to discover.
Well said. And on that note, it's time to say goodbye for now.
Until next time.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.